Trade talks between India and US have been ongoing for a while and now they have reached an advanced stage. India has identified 4 key red lines that it is negotiating on in these trade talks. Hello and welcome to Drishti IAS. My name is Saloni Nankyolier and in this video we will understand what red lines are and why are they so significant for India. So as we know that July 9 is approaching, and what is so special about July 9 is that on this day the 90-day tariff truce which was introduced by the US is going to end. And that is the reason that US is engaging actively in trade talks with a lot of countries, India being one of them. And what are the red lines in question here? So red lines are those non-negotiable sectors that a country refuses to compromise on because they are very, very sensitive. And they could be sensitive in terms of political, social, cultural or economic interests. So the red lines that India has identified are corn or maize, ethanol, soybean and dairy products. These are the 4 things that India has identified as non-negotiable, non-compromisable, and right now they are on the negotiation table. Let us understand the significance of all these one by one. First is corn or maize. So corn primarily is a kharif crop. In some regions, it is also grown in the Rabi season, but primarily this is a kharif crop. And India ranks 7th in the terms of global corn production. Which states are the major corn producing states in India? They are Karnataka, Andhra, MP and Bihar. These are the 4 major corn producing states in India. And if we look at the uses, there are many uses of corn. First, it is also used in human consumption, then in animal feed, and also in industrial usage in making ethanol. US is the world's largest producer and exporter of corn, which means corn is a very important crop for US. In fact, 90% of the area is under genetically modified corn production. So there's a thing with the US that a lot of crops that are produced in the US are genetically modified crops, because GM crops, they have a high ROI or return on investment. Because they have very lower costs of production, they are herbicide resistant, they are pest resistant, so they have very low cost of production, but they have a high yield and high productivity. So if the production of something is going to increase, naturally the export is also going to increase, and in turn the economy of the country is going to boost. So that is one of the reasons that crops in US are mostly genetically modified, because of the highly mechanized nature of agriculture there. But India's trade policy does not allow the import of genetically modified crops for human consumption or edible purposes. Why? Because we do not know about the health hazard of these crops in the long run. We do not know if they're going to trigger any allergies or they're going to pose any genetic kind of risk. So we do not know all these things. That is the reason that India does not allow the import of GM crops for human consumption. What is allowed is an import with 15% duty up to 0.5 million tons. And GM maize is not permitted due to biosafety hazards. Now, if we look at ethanol, so ethanol is a biofuel, which means that it is a fuel that is created from biomass. Biomass like corn, sugarcane or broken rice. So US is the world's largest ethanol producer and exporter, but India's import policy, again, it says that our ethanol imports cannot be used for fuel, because we want to achieve self-reliance in fuel production. There is an ethanol blending program in place. Under ethanol blending program, the target is to achieve 20% of ethanol blending in petrol by 2025. We are very close to achieving this target, and this target tells us that India wants to be self-reliant in its fuel production, and that is the reason that this ethanol import for fuel purposes is not allowed. It is allowed for non-fuel and industrial purposes, that too under special licenses. And we are doing this to safeguard our domestic producers, our small producers. So that is the reason that India does not allow the import of ethanol. Next, we have soybean. So soybean is also primarily a kharif crop. And the major soybean producing states are MP, Maharashtra, Rajasthan. These states are the major soybean producing states. The uses are, it is used in soybean oil, which is edible, in soy meal or DOC. DOC is oil cake, which is used as an animal feed, and also in export purposes. Soybean is a protein source in vegetarian diet. Now, US is the second largest global producer of soybean. Which country is the first? So that's Brazil. And over 95% of soybean is genetically modified in the US. Again, India's trade policy remains the same, that we do not allow the import of GM crops for human consumption. It allows only GM soy oil import because soy oil does not contain protein. There is no protein that will enter our food chain. So we do not allow the import of GM crops because we do not want any protein, any GM protein to enter our food chain either directly or indirectly. So it is not allowed for human consumption also, and it is not allowed for animal feed also, because via animals also it can enter our food chain. What is allowed instead is GM soy oil because it does not have any protein in it. Then it bans the import of GM whole bean and soy DOC because this again has protein, and this is being used as an animal feed. So this will make protein enter our food chain indirectly. Next, we have dairy and its related aspects. Now, dairy is a very strong sector for India. In fact, India is the world's largest milk producer. So much that we produce approximately 24% of world's total milk. So naturally, we are self-reliant, we are self-capable of meeting our domestic needs via our local production only. We do not need to rely a lot on imports for dairy product. And there is a socio-cultural and religious angle also associated with our dairy sector, that the dairy animals in India, they are not fed any blood meal or any non-vegetarian meal, which is not the case in other Western countries. So this is also one of the reasons that it is a very non-negotiable. In fact, it is one of the most non-negotiable sectors for India, that we will not allow dairy import for human consumption. There are high tariffs, which is 30 to 60% on dairy imports, because we already meet our dairy imports mostly by our domestic needs. Now, if we look at India's perspective, why is India doing all these things? Why is India putting forward these red lines? So India is doing all this to protect our farmers, to protect our small and marginalized farmers. In fact, 50% of the population in India, it depends upon agriculture in some way or the other. And out of that 50% also, 86% are small and marginalized farmers. They do not have huge land holdings. So we really need to protect their interests, because once these imports start happening, the local demand can go down, and in turn our small and marginalized farmers will be very, very affected. Then we also need to ensure our food safety by avoiding GM contamination, because we are not aware of the side effects of using GM crops in our diet. We wish to promote self-reliance through EBP, as we already discussed, and we also want to maintain our cultural and religious values, especially in the dairy sector. We want to avoid potential political fallout in agrarian states, because the states that are rich in agriculture, whose state income depends upon agriculture, they will be the most badly hit if a lot of imports are allowed in the agriculture sector. But what is US's take here? So US wants greater market access for its products. As we saw that US is the largest producer and exporter of corn, it wants a greater market access for its product, and that is the reason it is engaging in a lot of trade talks, especially with the South Asian and Southeast Asian countries like India, Vietnam, Indonesia. So US wants access, greater market access to all these countries, and it wishes for a reduction in tariff and non-tariff barriers, because US feels that India is following protectionism, where we are protecting our domestic producers. So it wishes for a reduction in tariff and non-tariff barriers, and it wants a fairer treatment and reciprocity in trade terms. So we have mostly maintained a trade surplus with the US, and US now wishes reciprocity in these terms, where it also wants to access the market of India and face lesser tariff restrictions. So what could be some potential solutions here? The solutions are that we can allow for controlled imports of things, definitely not for human consumption, but some controlled imports for non-food purposes or industrial purposes under special licenses. We can have strict tracing and segregation system for identifying which GM products can be used, what is the permissible limit, and which cannot be used. And then there are also some challenges that we are going to get resistance from farmers and the state governments, especially the states that rely on agriculture for their state domestic product, and farmers which are small and marginalized. Then we're also going to get cultural opposition to GM and dairy standards. This is highly unlikely. It's very unlikely for India to accept import of dairy products because of the socio-cultural religious norms that we have. There is a risk to domestic industries. Our sugar, soybean and dairy industries, they can be badly hit, because if ethanol starts to be imported for fuel purposes, our domestic industries are going to be affected. Then the upcoming elections, because there are elections in a lot of states, so the upcoming elections may also influence the negotiation outcomes. There could be some rebellion, there could be some deterrence from the states that depend on agriculture. So what is the way forward for India? This is a good opportunity for both India and the US, because both want access to each other's markets. So definitely a trade deal should be there in place, but it needs to be balanced. It needs to be balanced in its economic goals and political realities. We can think of opening some sectors while protecting our core interests, and we can think of having transparent public consultation, farmer safeguards, and scientific risk assessment to understand what can be allowed, what kind of imports can be allowed, and what cannot be allowed at all. So that was all for today's video. These trade talks are still under discussion. They have not been finalized yet, but an interim trade pact is expected to come sometime by July 9. So let us see what happens here. But now let's look at a practice question for prelims. Consider the following statements regarding the recent India-US trade negotiations. 1. India currently allows the import of genetically modified maize for animal feed use. 2. Ethanol imports into India are permitted only for industrial use, not for blending with fuel. 3. India imposes higher import duties on dairy products and also requires that imported dairy must come from animals not fed on bovine-derived formulations. How many of the statements given above is or are correct? A. Only 1. B. Only 2. C. All 3. D. None of these. Please provide your answers in the comment section and I will pin down the correct one. That was all for today's video. Until we meet the next time, please keep studying and keep revising.
For more informative content, like, share and subscribe, and do not forget to press the bell icon to get the notifications.